when bits bite. Why companies struggle with recalcitrant IT. It is supposed to be the Tesla killer. The firm's new ID.3 is the Volkswagen's new ID.3 is the firm's first mass-produced all-electric cars and the first step in the German carmaker's attempts to reinvent itself for an electrified world. That perhaps makes it the most important model since the original Golf launched in 1976. The ID.3 is also late. Mechanically, the car is hunky-dory. But some software widgets are rumored that are a big selling point these days, rumored to include smartphone connectivity and augmented reality parking assistance, may be missing at first, only to be added later. Originally set for this summer, the launch has been pushed back at least until September. Until at least September. VW is not the only company struggling to make its computers work. Last year, British banks were hauled over the coals by regulators for online outages and botched IT upgrades that left millions of customers unable to make or receive payments. Some problems are much more serious. A Boeing 737 MAX aircraft were grounded in 2019 after two fatal crashes caused partly by a software flaw. Investigators have since found lesser bugs. Airlines are, for instance, now advised to turn the plane off and on again every 51 days to stop its computers displaying false data in mid-flight. A similar problem found in some airplanes made by Airbus. A similar problem found in 2017 in some airplanes made by Airbus, Boeing's European rival, prompted the European Union Aviation Safety Agency to require such aircraft be rebooted at least every 149 hours. Blame for companies' IT woes often end up in the boardroom. Sometimes that is fair. Dennis Muilenburg was rightly forced to resign as Boeing CEO after the tragic 737 MAX disasters. But not always. For software is hard and hard to keep up with. And the employees are expected to produce are often the products of a discipline that is in many ways oddly pre-modern. When software is eating the world, Silicon Valley speak for a situation where most firms are to a greater or lesser extent software companies that matters. Start with the computer code itself. Software requires a mix of hyper-literalness and creativity. Tiny errors like a tiny misplaced punctuation mark. Tiny errors like a misplaced punctuation mark can completely change how a system behaves. An industry rule of thumb is that depending on how carefully they work, programmers make between 0.5 and 50 errors in every 1,000 lines of code they write. Because cars and aircraft contain tens of millions of lines, the chances of an error-free system are in effect zero. Even when the bugs do not lead to catastrophe, they put on a constant drag on a firm's productivity. A survey commissioned by Stripe, an online payments processor, suggested that the average developer spends 21 hours a week fixing old or bad code. The inherent difficulty of programming is made worse by the shortcomings of software engineering as a profession. These are laid out in a book. The software problem: why smart engineers write bad code. The author, Adam Barr, spent 20 years as a developer for Microsoft, a software giant. Many coders he notes are at least partly self-taught. That leads to bad habits which software engineering courses fail to correct. There is too little communication between academia and industry, and no real agreement on what to teach and what habits to instill. The result, argues Mr. Barr, is a field where folklore and fads too often take the place of professional standards. To illustrate the field's shaky foundations, Mr. Barr points to the practice, popular with technology firms like Google or Apple, of giving job candidates a programming problem to solve on a whiteboard. Few other fields behave that way because they assume by dint of having graduated that applicants have achieved a basic level of competence. Doctors do not expect anatomy quizzes before being hired. Mechanical engineers are not required to jot down Newton's laws of motion to prove their bona fides. All those problems are compounded by software engineering's breathless rate of change. Even when a system works, it rapidly becomes obsolete. The woes of British banks are largely the result of trying to maintain such legacy systems, written by long-departed programmers, often outsourced, in half-forgotten computer languages, to satisfy criteria, no one can quite remember. Coders under pressure to add nifty new features often cut corners, storing up problems for the ever less distant future. The result says one expert with decades of experience, is that shiny new IT systems can rapidly devolve into rickety, half-understood contraptions held together by gaffer tape and a prayer. Eventually, the costs become too great to ignore, and companies must upgrade their systems. But that is the moment of maximum danger, for the new software must do everything the half understood old one does and more. It is to repeat a common but opposite analogy, like rebuilding an aircraft in flight. VW is doing its best to iron out the kinks with the ID.3's snazzy features. The firm wants to bring most software engineering back in-house, and has spent €7 billion, that's $8 billion, on a shiny new digital unit. That is probably a good idea. But Mr. Barr argues that structural problems with writing code mean that spending money on it does not itself guarantee success. By itself guarantee success. One great advantage possessed by startups like Tesla or Monzo, a newish One great advantage possessed by startups such as Tesla or Monzo, a newish British online bank, is that their programmers are handed a blank sheet of paper. With no legacy systems to maintain and fewer bugs to root out, their programmers can spend more Their software is more robust, and their programmers can spend more time on features that customers want. If there is cold comfort for all the companies that have no easy way of starting afresh, computer graybeards offer a reassurance after a fashion. The startup's advantages, they predict, will prove temporary. Bugs will creep in, botched jobs will go unfixed. Developers will leave, taking knowledge with them. Today's feisty usurpers will become tomorrow's clumsy incumbents held back by their antiquated unreliable IT and ripe for disruption in turn.